Three men went into a storm tunnel on a Tuesday afternoon and never came back up. And the hatch they went down through was still bolted from the outside when I got there. I want you to sit with that for a second. Bolted from the outside. Which means whatever happened to Owen, Marcus, and Pete happened in a sealed system with no exit we could account for. I have spent 3 years turning that fact over in my hands like a stone I cannot put down, and I still cannot tell you how it fits into any version of reality I was trained to believe in. But I can tell you exactly what I found when I crouched at that opening, and I can tell you what it smelled like, and I can tell you about the single work glove folded neatly over a pipe bracket at shoulder height, like someone had hung it there before leaving for the day. Not dropped, not snagged. Folded. That detail woke me up at 3 in the morning more times than I can count. Because dropped means accident. Folded means intention. And intention means something down there was thinking. My name is Daniel Marsh. I was a city drainage inspector for 11 years before the night that changed what that job meant to me. I drove to that site in the dark with a cup of bad gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder, running through the most likely explanations in my head the way I always did. Blockage at a junction. Equipment failure. Maybe one of the guys twisted an ankle in the dark and the others stayed with him, and the radio signal dropped because signal always dropped in the lower corridors. I had a whole list of boring, fixable explanations, and I was going through them one by one because that was my job, and I was good at my job, and I had never once found a problem underground that turned out to be anything other than concrete, water, and human error. I want you to remember that version of me, because he disappears pretty quickly from this story. The industrial quarter where this happened sits at the edge of the city in that particular way that neglected places do, where everything looks functional from a distance, but up close you start to see the rust, the sagging fences, the loading docks that haven't moved freight in 20 years. It's the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights work maybe 2 out of 3, where the pavement has been patched so many times it looks like a quilt, and where the drainage infrastructure underneath it is so old that parts of it exist only on paper copies held by men who retired before I was born. We're talking about tunnels and trunk lines built in an era when the city was a fraction of its current size, expanded piecemeal over decades by engineers who inherited incomplete plans and did the best they could, sealed off in sections when the budget ran out, rerouted when new roads required it, and eventually just left alone because the water moved through well enough and nobody wanted to spend the money to go down and look properly. I had worked that sector for 4 years. I knew which pump stations failed first under load, which access shafts flooded fastest in heavy rain, which sections of tunnel were on the active maintenance rotation, and which ones had quietly dropped off the schedule because nobody could justify the cost. I thought I knew the place. I thought knowing the infrastructure meant knowing the place. That was the category error I had been making for years without realizing it, because infrastructure and place are not the same thing. Infrastructure is what you build. Place is what accumulates while you're not looking. The rain that Tuesday had been steady since mid-morning, the kind of gray, persistent rain that doesn't feel dramatic, but moves a serious volume of water through an old system. Flow levels in the lower trunk lines were elevated, but not critical. Conditions were well within the range the crew handled routinely. Owen had been doing this for 7 years. Marcus was the kind of guy who fixed things with whatever was in his pockets and never seemed rattled by anything underground. Pete was newer, but he was with 2 experienced people, and the job was a 2-hour call, straightforward, the sort of thing we logged and forgot about by the next morning. They checked in at the top of the access shaft at the start of their descent. That was the last contact anyone had with them. By the time the foreman called it in, 4 hours had passed and the rain had not let up, and I was already 20 minutes out from the site, thinking about blockages and radio dead zones and everything except what I would actually find when I got there. I remember the windshield wipers going and the radio on low, some late-night talk show, the host laughing at something the guest said. I remember thinking I'd be home by midnight. If you've never stood at the edge of something that doesn't make sense yet and felt the exact moment your brain starts trying to walk it back, to reassemble the evidence into something manageable, I hope you never have to, because once you've felt it, you recognize it every time. And I felt it the second I saw that bolt. If this story is staying with you, go ahead and subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and there is a lot more of this to get through. I need to tell you who I was before that night, because the version of me that drove to that access point and the version of me that drove away from it are two genuinely different people, and the distance between them is the whole point of everything I'm about to say. 11 years in drainage inspection does something specific to the way you think. It's not that the job makes you cynical exactly. It's more that it makes you very comfortable with cause and effect. Water goes somewhere it shouldn't. You find out why. Pipe cracked. Joint failed. Somebody dumped something they shouldn't have, and it blocked a channel. The physical world underground is unpleasant, but it is legible. And legibility is deeply reassuring when you're spending your shifts in the dark below a city. I was genuinely good at reading it. I could walk into a flooded pump station and within 20 minutes have a working theory about what failed and in what order. My supervisor used to say I had a feel for systems, and I took that as the highest possible compliment because it was true and because I had worked hard to make it true. I had a wife named Carol who packed 2 sandwiches in my bag on night shifts because she knew I wouldn't stop to eat otherwise. I had a 12-year-old daughter named Sophie who was going through a phase of asking me extremely specific questions about how sewers worked, which I found both flattering and slightly concerning. I had a mortgage, a used car with high mileage, a gym membership I used inconsistently, and a very clear sense of what the world was made of and how it behaved. I believed in material causes. I believed that every effect had a source you could locate, measure, and in most cases, fix. I believed that people who talked about things they couldn't explain were people who hadn't looked carefully enough yet. I want to be honest with you about that belief because it's important. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was more like a working assumption that had never failed me. 11 years is a long time for an assumption to hold up, long enough that it stops feeling like an assumption and starts feeling like a fact. Long enough that when something finally breaks it, the breaking is total, because the assumption was load-bearing in a way you didn't realize until it wasn't there anymore. The week before Owen's crew went down, I had a conversation with a woman named Gloria, who had been running pump operations in that sector longer than anyone else still employed there. She was one of those people who carries institutional knowledge the way others carry keys, quietly, automatically, indispensable. She mentioned, in passing, the way you mention something you've already filed away as probably nothing, that the pressure readings in the lower channels had been inconsistent for several weeks. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off, in ways that didn't match the rainfall data or the flow volume. She mentioned that a rat colony that had been living in one of the vent stacks for years had relocated upward over a single weekend. All of them, completely. which she had never seen happen before. She said it the way you say the weather's been odd lately, observational, not alarmed, and I nodded and said I'd flag it for the next inspection cycle, which was the professional equivalent of forgetting about it immediately. I did forget about it immediately. I had 3 other active calls that week, and a report due on a retaining wall survey, and a meeting I did not want to attend. Gloria's pressure readings went into the part of my brain reserved for anomalies that would probably resolve themselves, right next to the gym membership. I did not think about them again until I was standing at the access shaft in the rain, looking at a bolt that should not have been in the position it was in. And then I thought about them, very hard and very fast, the way you think about every small thing you dismissed when the large thing finally arrives and you start doing the accounting. That is the thing about warnings. They don't announce themselves as warnings. They arrive looking like footnotes. The neighborhood had been trying to warn us for years, and we kept mistaking the warnings for maintenance issues. I know how that sounds. But let me tell you what the industrial quarter actually looked like in the weeks before Owen's crew went down. Because the atmosphere of a place is not decoration. It is data. And if I had been paying attention to it as data instead of background noise, I think the story I am telling you right now might have had a different ending. The quarter sits on ground that was developed fast and cheap in an era when the city needed expansion more than it needed quality. The buildings are mostly low and wide, warehouses and light manufacturing units with corrugated roofs that sound like a drum line in heavy rain. Between them run narrow service roads that flood at the curb when the drains back up, which they did regularly, which was partly why our office had a standing presence in that sector. The whole area has a particular smell in wet weather, wet concrete and iron and something underneath both of those that I always assumed was just old drain water rising through the grates. I know now that I was only half right about that. What I remember most from that period is how the light felt. This is going to sound like a strange detail, but bear with me. In the late afternoon, especially on overcast days, the light in the industrial quarter had a quality I have not been able to accurately describe to anyone who hasn't stood there. Flat and yellowish and close to the ground, like the sky was pressing down. The overhead lights in the service roads came on at dusk, and half of them were out on any given night, which meant you moved through alternating pools of amber and total dark. Puddles reflected the working lights and made the ground look deeper than it was. You were always stepping over your own reflection. I drove through on a Wednesday evening about 10 days before the call came in, doing a routine check of pump station access points. Nothing unusual on paper. But I remember sitting in the car outside one of the great housings and watching a pair of stray dogs that had been following the fence line stop dead at a certain point and refuse to go further. They weren't frightened the way dogs get frightened by a loud noise, all flinching and backing up. They were still, precise, like they had hit an invisible wall and made a calm decision not to cross it. I watched them for maybe 2 minutes. Then I wrote down the pump station reading and drove back to the office, and did not write down anything about the dogs, because there was no field on the inspection form for that. There are no fields on any form for the things that matter most. That is something I have thought about a great deal since. The grates themselves. I want to talk about the grates because they became important later, and I want you to understand what they were like before I knew to pay attention to them. They were heavy cast iron, most of them original to the infrastructure, which meant they were old enough to have warped slightly in their frames over decades of thermal expansion. In dry weather, they sat flat and solid. In wet weather, some of them shifted fractionally with water pressure changes below, lifting at one edge and settling back with a sound like a single, low knock. This was a known and documented behavior. We logged it as non-critical structural settling. I had heard that sound hundreds of times from street level. I had stepped over those grates without a second thought, and I had never once considered what it would sound like from below. Whether anything below might have learned to recognize the pattern of it, the rhythm of a city moving overhead. I am getting ahead of myself, but not by much. Gloria mentioned the pressure anomalies to me on a Thursday morning in the break room, the same break room with the flickering fluorescent tube that maintenance had been meaning to replace for 6 months. She was drinking coffee that was too hot the way she always did, holding the cup with both hands and talking in the direction of the window rather than at me directly, which was her way when she was saying something she wasn't sure she wanted said. She told me the readings in the lower channel network had been inconsistent for about 3 weeks. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off in a way that didn't match the rainfall data or the known flow volumes. She had cross-checked them twice. She said it felt like displacement, like something was occupying volume in a section that should have been empty. She used that word, occupying, and then immediately softened it by saying it was probably sensor drift, because the sensors in that section were old, and nobody had recalibrated them recently. I agreed that it was probably sensor drift. We finished our coffee, and the conversation moved on to something else. What I did not do was ask her what she thought it was if it wasn't sensor drift. I did not ask because the way she was looking at the window told me the answer would be something I did not have a category for, and I was very attached to my categories. That same afternoon, a guy named Walt, who did vent maintenance in the lower access sections, mentioned to nobody in particular at the end of the shift that the rat colony in Vent Stack 7 had cleared out over the weekend. All of them. He said it with the mildly puzzled tone of someone reporting that their usual parking spot was empty, noting it without alarm. I remember thinking that rat movements in old infrastructure were essentially meaningless as indicators of anything, because rats were unpredictable, and the tunnels had a dozen variables that could shift a colony's behavior. I filed it in the same mental drawer as the dogs at the fence line. I closed that drawer. I closed it very firmly, and for 8 more days, while Owen and Marcus and Pete were still alive, it stayed closed. The thing about a drawer you close on purpose is that part of you knows exactly what you put in it. Gloria knew something lived down there. She just never said it out loud because saying it out loud would have made it her problem. I only understood that later. At the time, I thought she was being vague the way tired people are vague, running on too much coffee and too many years in a job that asked more than it paid. But I have replayed that Thursday morning conversation in the break room so many times since then that I can now read the spaces between what she said as clearly as the words themselves. And what was in those spaces was not vagueness. It was a very deliberate choice about how much truth a person can hand another person before it stops being helpful and starts being something else entirely. The day after she mentioned the pressure readings, I ran into her again near the vehicle bay. She was signing out a handheld sensor unit for a check she was doing solo, which was unusual because Gloria almost always worked with a partner in the lower sections. I asked her about it, and she said her usual partner had called in, and she didn't want to wait. Normal enough. But then she said something that I let pass at the time, and only caught the full weight of much later. She said she preferred going alone to that section anyway, because at least then she didn't have to manage anyone else's reaction. Reaction to what? I asked. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I can only describe as measuring, like she was calculating exactly how far the road went before the bridge was out. Then she said, to the things you hear when the channel runs low and the flow noise drops and it gets quiet down there in the way that quiet shouldn't be that quiet. I said something about acoustics, old pipes, echo, the usual. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they already knew you were going to say that. Then she picked up her kit and walked out to the van, and I watched her go and thought nothing more of it for the rest of that day. But here's what Gloria had heard. I found this out weeks later, after everything, sitting in her kitchen while she told me in the same measured, window-directed way she had in the break room, like the words were safer if she didn't look directly at them. In the lower channel network, in the oldest section of the trunk line where the concrete was the original pour from decades back, and the walls were dark with age and mineral seep, there were sounds during low flow periods that did not belong to the infrastructure. Not settling, not pressure, something that moved. A sound she described as deliberate weight shifting, like the difference between a bag dropped on a floor and a person crossing one. And underneath that, occasionally, a kind of slow, rhythmic scrape against the channel wall. Not random, patterned, the same interval, the same duration, then silence, then again. She had heard it first about 8 months before Owen's crew went in. She had told no one, because she knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent 20 years underground, that what she was hearing was not a maintenance issue. And if it was not a maintenance issue, there was no form for it, no procedure, no budget line, and no supervisor who was going to thank her for raising it. So she kept going down there, alone, with her sensors and her hand lamp, and she listened, and she measured, and she kept the measurements to herself. And she learned the schedule of it, roughly, the way you learn a neighbor's routine without meaning to. It moved most during heavy rain events. It went very still when the flow noise dropped. It occupied the lower eastern branch of the trunk line like it had always been there. And it had never, in 8 months of her monitoring it, come near the upper access corridors. Until the week Owen's crew was scheduled to go in. The pressure anomalies she mentioned to me, the ones she filed as probable sensor drift, had started 3 weeks before the call, and they were concentrated in the junction section, the exact junction section Owen, Marcus, and Pete were sent to clear. I am not saying she knew what would happen. I am absolutely not saying that. What I am saying is that she knew something had changed in the pattern she had been tracking for months. Something had moved closer to the section where people would be working. And she mentioned it to me in the way she mentioned it, carefully, deniably, sideways, because she had already decided that a direct statement would not be believed and might get her laughed out of a job she needed. That decision haunts me. Not because I blame her, but because I understand it completely. I would have made the same choice. Probably did, in ways I haven't fully accounted for yet. Now I have to tell you about the explanations I built, because this is the part where I stop being a victim of the situation and start being a participant in it, and I think that distinction matters. After the conversation with Gloria, after Walt's offhand comment about the rats, after the evening I watched 2 dogs stop cold at an invisible line in the service road and make a considered decision not to cross it, I had everything I needed to ask a serious question. Not necessarily the right question, not the question about what was actually down there, but at minimum, the question of whether the lower eastern section needed a precautionary inspection before we sent a crew in for routine maintenance. I did not ask that question. I want to be precise about why, because I think most people in my position would have done the same thing, and I think that is part of the larger problem I am trying to describe. The reason I did not ask is that asking would have required me to assemble those 3 data points, the pressure readings, the rat colony, the dogs, into a pattern. And the moment I assembled them into a pattern, the pattern pointed somewhere I did not have language for. It pointed to something that was aware of the tunnel system, that moved deliberately through it, that the local animals had already registered and responded to with the kind of calm, practical avoidance that animals use for things they have taken the measure of and decided to respect. That is not a conclusion you can walk into your supervisor's office with on a Tuesday morning. That is not a line you can write on an inspection request form. I know, because I sat at my desk that Friday before the call came in, and I thought about it, and I could not find a single sentence that would survive the first 5 seconds of professional scrutiny. And so I did what people do when they have a conclusion that has no acceptable container. I took it apart. I put the pressure readings back under sensor drift. I put the rats back under environmental variables. I put the dogs back under animal behavior, unpredictable, meaningless, not my department. And then I went home and had dinner with Carol and Sophie, and watched something on television and went to bed. And 4 days later my phone rang, and Owen's foreman told me his crew had missed their check-in and the hatch was still bolted from the outside, and there was nobody answering on the radio. The drawer I had closed so firmly was about to open from the other side. The foreman's voice on the phone was the kind of flat and careful that people use when they are trying very hard not to say the word they are actually thinking. He said the crew had missed their second check-in. He said the radio was not connecting. He said he had driven past the access point himself, and the hatch looked undisturbed from the street. He used the word undisturbed twice, which told me he had already been standing there in the rain trying to make the hatch mean something other than what it meant. I told him I was on my way and not to send anyone else down until I got there. He agreed immediately, which told me he had already decided he wasn't going down there himself and was relieved to have a professional reason not to. I want to tell you about the drive, because the drive is where the last of my rational explanations started to thin out. It was raining steadily, the kind of rain that doesn't vary, no gusts, no breaks, just a constant gray pressure against the windshield. The streets in that part of the city empty out fast in that kind of weather, not because people are afraid of rain, but because there is something about sustained, unvarying rainfall that makes being outside feel purposeless. So the roads were mostly clear, and I drove fast, and I went through my list of explanations one more time, the way you run your hand along a wall in the dark to make sure it is still there. Equipment failure, radio dead zone, an injury that kept them stationary, maybe a secondary blockage they had gone to investigate deeper in the system without logging it first, which would be a protocol violation, but not the first one I had ever dealt with. I was almost convinced by the time I pulled up to the site, and then I saw the hatch, and the list dissolved completely. The bolt was seated, the padlock was closed, both exactly as we had left them when the crew went in, which was the whole and total problem, because there was no way for the crew to have secured the bolt and closed the padlock from the inside. The mechanism only worked from street level. I crouched down with my hand lamp and looked at the lock for a long time, turning that fact over, feeling it resist every shape I tried to press it into. The foreman was standing a few feet back with his collar up and water running off the brim of his cap. He watched me examine the lock and said nothing because he had already examined it himself and arrived at the same dead end. I took the key from my kit and opened the padlock and lifted the hatch. The smell hit me before I had it fully open. I want to be careful here because smell is the thing people always find hardest to believe. It seems like the kind of detail a person adds afterward to make a story more vivid. But I am telling you this exactly as it was. The smell that came up from that shaft was not sewage. Every inspector knows sewage. You live with sewage smell in this job. It becomes as unremarkable as engine exhaust. This was underneath sewage. Hotter than it should have been given the ambient temperature. Dense in a way that made me aware of my own throat, and carrying something animal in it that I cannot describe more precisely than this. It smells like something large had been living in an enclosed space for a very long time. I shone my lamp down the shaft. The access ladder descended about 6 meters to the channel floor. At the bottom, in the silt at the edge of the water line, one of the crew's headlamps lay face up, still running, its beam pointing straight at the ceiling of the tunnel in a narrow white column. On the left side of the shaft, at roughly shoulder height, one of the crew's work gloves was folded over a pipe bracket. Not hanging, not snagged on a rough edge, folded, placed, with the kind of deliberateness that belongs to a person taking a break and hanging up their gear before continuing work. Pete was the newest member of the crew. He had small hands. I recognized the glove size. I stood up and told the foreman to call it in as a missing person situation and to make sure nobody went down that shaft until I had backup. My voice came out steady, which surprised me, because inside something had gone very quiet in the way that things go quiet right before they become very loud. I want to be honest about the next 2 hours, because I think the honesty matters more than the story does at this point. I waited for Ray, the structural officer I had worked with before, a man who had done confined space rescues and was trained for situations where the tunnel environment itself was the hazard. While I waited, I sat in my car with the engine running and the heater on, and I did not call Carol, which I would normally do if a call was running long, because I did not know what I would say. I just sat there, watching the rain move across the windshield in sheets, and thinking about a folded glove on a pipe bracket, and trying to find a version of that image that meant something other than what it looked like. I could not find one. I am still looking. Ray arrived 40 minutes later in his department vehicle, solid and unhurried the way he always was, the kind of man who moved through bad situations at the same speed he moved through everything else, which was not slow, but was never rushed. He looked at the hatch, looked at me, looked at the hatch again. Then he said, "What do you think we are walking into down there?" I said I did not know, which was true, but I already knew it was not a blockage. We geared up in silence, rain on the corrugated roofs of the surrounding warehouses, a steady percussion that filled the space where conversation would have been. Ray checked his lamp twice, which was one more time than he usually checked it. I noticed that. I noticed he had also clipped his radio to his chest strap at a position where he could reach it with either hand without looking, which was not standard configuration. Ray was adjusting for something. He just wasn't naming it yet. We started down the ladder at a few minutes past midnight, our lamps cutting clean circles in the dark below us, the smell thickening with every rung. The sound of the rain above us faded. The sound of moving water below us grew. And somewhere between those two sounds, in the register where they overlapped. I heard something that my brain tried immediately to assign to pipe resonance or pressure shift or any one of a dozen ordinary tunnel acoustics. It did not stay assigned there for long. The first thing Ray said when his lamp hit the junction wall was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when their body understands something before their mind has finished processing it. I was 2 steps behind him, and I came around the corner and I saw what he saw, and I stood completely still for what felt like a long time, but was probably about 4 seconds. The concrete barrier between the main trunk line and the older eastern branch had been worked on from the inside. Not collapsed, not cracked by water pressure, not failed in any way that infrastructure fails. 3 blocks in the lower section had been cleared of mortar in a rough arc, the mortar scraped out cleanly, the blocks themselves shifted inward by a few centimeters each, just enough to create a gap at the base large enough for something substantial to move through. The edges of the cleared mortar were worn smooth. This had not happened in a single event. This had happened over time, incrementally, the way a person solves a slow problem with repeated, patient effort. Ray crouched down and put his lamp close to the gap and looked through it for a moment without speaking. Then he stood up and looked at me. Neither of us said the word we were both thinking, which was not a structural term and had no place on any report form we had ever filled out. What I said instead was, "How long do you think this took?" Ray said, "Weeks, minimum." I said, "So whatever made this was here before the crew came in?" He said yes, very quietly. And then we both looked at the gap again, and then we looked at the passage ahead of us, the one we still had to move through to find Owen and Marcus and Pete. And the silence between us was the kind that happens when 2 experienced people arrive at a conclusion they would both prefer to be wrong about. The passage beyond the junction was the oldest section of the trunk line, the part that predated the city's major expansion, built with a slightly lower ceiling and walls that had absorbed decades of mineral seep until they were dark and slick and carried a cold that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature outside. Our lamps threw long shadows ahead of us that moved when we moved, which is a rational optical effect of walking with a light source, and which my nervous system was no longer interpreting rationally. What struck me most was the floor of the channel. The silt in the main section had shown flow marks, the ordinary striations that moving water leaves when it settles. The silt in this passage was different. It had been disturbed and resettled in patterns that did not match water flow. There were long, smooth impressions, not footprints exactly, but the kind of marks that would be left by something that moved close to the ground and distributed its weight differently than a person walking upright would. They ran along the left wall consistently, which told me something about preference, about a habitual route, about a thing that moved through this space regularly enough to wear a path. I pointed them out to Ray with my lamp, and he nodded once and kept moving, and I could see from the set of his shoulders that he was doing the same thing I was, which was building his professional composure around himself like a structure he needed to stay inside of in order to keep going forward. We found Owen and Marcus in the secondary corridor, 20 meters past the junction. I said earlier that I was not going to describe it in detail, and I am keeping that promise. Not because I am protecting you, but because the specific details serve nothing except to make this harder to hear, and it is already hard enough. What I will tell you is the thing that has stayed with me most clearly, clearer than anything else from that night. Clearer than the smell or the sound or the gap in the junction wall. It was efficient. Not chaotic, not the scene of something that panicked or raged or acted without purpose. Whoever or whatever had been in that corridor with Owen and Marcus had been completely in control of what it was doing from the first moment to the last. There was no evidence of a struggle that spread, no scattered equipment, nothing that suggested the situation had been anything other than entirely one-sided from the start. It was, and I know how cold this sounds, organized, the way a competent person organizes their work. I have to pause on that word because I think it is the most important word in this entire account. Organized. Not frenzied, not panicked, not opportunistic in the way that a wild animal is opportunistic, responding to a stimulus and acting on instinct. What happened in that corridor had been considered, and the thing that considered it had then executed it during the peak noise window of the rain event in the oldest and least mapped section of the system, at a junction it had been quietly preparing for weeks. Pete was not there. We searched the secondary corridor as far as we could go without entering the gap in the barrier, which neither of us was willing to do. No sign of Pete. His equipment was gone too, not left behind. Gone. I have thought about what that means more times than I can count, and I have never arrived at an explanation that I am comfortable sharing. So I will simply tell you that Pete was not found that night or any night after, and leave the implications where they belong, in the dark section of this story that I do not have the language or the courage to fully enter. What I do have the language for is timing. Because as Ray and I stood in that corridor and I was running my lamp along the walls trying to find anything else I should be documenting, I realized something that shifted the entire shape of what I was looking at. The rain event that evening had been forecast. It was on the Public Weather Service that morning. Elevated flow, extended duration, peak noise window estimated between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. The crew had been sent in at the start of that window on a job that would take them directly to the junction, directly to the section where the barrier had been prepared, during the period when the water noise in the channel would be at its highest and would cover any other sound completely. I want you to think about what it means for something to use a weather forecast. Not consciously, maybe, but to have learned over time that certain conditions overhead meant certain conditions below, that noise meant cover, that cover meant opportunity, and to have been patient enough to wait for exactly the right combination before moving. That is not feral behavior. That is something much harder to name and much harder to protect against, because there is no fence you build against a thing that has already learned your schedule. Ray tapped my arm and pointed back toward the junction. Time to move. I took one last look at the corridor, and then I turned and followed him, and I did not look back. Not because I was being professional, but because I was genuinely afraid of what my lamp might show behind us if I did. We were moving back toward the access shaft, and I was focused on Ray's lamp ahead of me, and on the sound of my own breathing, and on the mechanical action of putting one foot in front of the other, when the floor grate beneath Ray simply gave way. Ray did not fall. He was pulled. That is the distinction I need you to understand before anything else, because the difference between a man losing his footing and a man being taken from below is not subtle when you are standing 2 meters away watching it happen. The grate did not collapse under his weight. It did not rust through or shift on a corroded frame. It opened, fast and deliberate, from underneath, and Ray went down hard to his left, hitting the channel wall with his shoulder at an angle that made a sound I will not try to describe. And his lamp spun across the floor and came to rest against the far wall, throwing everything into long, tilted shadows. I moved before I had a conscious thought about moving. I was on my knees beside him, and I had his harness with both hands, and I was pulling. And I want to tell you that what I felt through that harness was resistance, not dead weight, not the passive resistance of a man who has fallen and cannot move yet, but active resistance, the kind that comes from something pulling in the opposite direction. Something below the open grate had Ray and was pulling him down through it, and I was pulling up, and for what felt like a very long time, those two forces were exactly equal. I do not know what I said. I know I was saying something because I could hear my own voice, but I cannot retrieve the words. Ray was making sounds that told me he was conscious and fighting, and I focused on that, and I pulled harder than I have ever pulled on anything in my life. And then the resistance released. Not gradually, not in stages, all at once, the way a rope goes slack when it is cut. Ray came up off the floor and I caught him against my chest, and we hit the wall together and stayed there for a moment, both of us breathing like we had surfaced from deep water. His shoulder was wrong. I could see it even in the uneven light, the way his left arm sat against his body, the careful stillness of it that meant movement hurt in a way he was not going to acknowledge yet. His face was gray in the lamplight, and his eyes were very wide and very focused, the eyes of someone who has taken a serious shock and is using every available resource to stay functional. I got him upright. I picked up my lamp from where I had dropped it. I pointed it at the open grate in the floor, and we both looked down into it for exactly 1 second. And what I saw in that 1 second, I am going to describe to you very simply. Dark water below, moving, and in the water, at the edge of the lamp's reach, something large and pale, receding into the darkness of the deeper channel below. Then we moved, not ran, because the floor was wet, and Ray's shoulder meant he could not use his left arm for balance. But we moved as fast as we safely could, back through the secondary corridor, back past the junction, back into the main trunk line, back to the base of the access shaft. And I went up the ladder first, and Ray handed me his good arm, and I pulled him out onto the wet pavement of the service road, and we sat there in the rain for a moment, not speaking, just breathing, while the foreman stood 10 meters away watching us with the expression of a man who had decided he was not going to ask the question that was in his face. I reached into my jacket pocket for my radio. The bolt for the hatch was there, in my pocket. I had no memory of putting it there. I do not know at what point in the descent or the return I had taken it from the lock housing. My hands had done it without informing the rest of me, which told me something about what my body had understood while my mind was still catching up. I closed the hatch. I seated the bolt. I stood in the rain with Ray sitting against the vehicle behind me and his damaged shoulder held carefully against his side, and I looked at that bolt for a long time. Then I called it in. Now I need to tell you about the moment I have kept to myself for 3 years. The thing I did not put in any statement, did not mention to the foreman, did not tell Carol that night when I finally got home at 4 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table and she brought me tea and did not ask questions because she could see from my face that the questions would have to wait. It happened in the few seconds between Ray being released and us hitting the wall together, in the gap between the resistance ending and us finding our footing. There was a window of maybe 2, maybe 3 seconds, where the tunnel was relatively quiet, where the water flow noise was briefly lower, where there was a brief acoustic opening in all that sound. And in that opening, I heard something come up through the open grate that my brain processed, very fast and very unwillingly, as language. Not clear language, not a sentence, A sound that had been shaped by something that understood shaping sounds, that had learned the general architecture of words without having the apparatus to produce them cleanly. Rough and wet and pulled through a register that felt wrong in a physical way, like hearing a familiar song played on an instrument it was never written for. What it sounded like was my name. Marsh. 2 syllables, the right stress pattern, the consonants recognizable even through the distortion, and underneath it, or maybe woven into it, a second sound that might have been a word or might have been nothing, that I have turned over in my head so many times it has worn smooth, and I still cannot tell you with certainty what it was. I know what I heard. I also know that the tunnel acoustics were complex, that Ray's impact against the wall had produced echoes, that my adrenaline was at a level that would compromise any sensory interpretation. I hold all of that in one hand. In the other hand, I hold the fact that Gloria's predecessor, the man who had worked that sector for 30 years before her, had told her one thing above all others about the lower eastern branch. He had told her that whatever moved down there had been listening to the city overhead for so long that it had started to absorb the sounds. Not mimic them, absorb them. The way a wall absorbs heat, slowly, over time, until it holds more warmth than the room around it. If that man was right, then what came up through that grate already knew my name before I ever set foot in that tunnel. It had heard it through grates and pipe housings and ceiling vents, in the ordinary course of people saying it to each other on the street above, at the pump station, in the vehicle bay. It had been collecting it along with every other sound the city produced, filing it away in whatever serves it for memory. And it had chosen to use it in that moment, not randomly, at the exact moment we were separated by the open grate, at the exact moment the noise window dropped, at the exact moment it would have the greatest possible effect on a person trying to make a rational decision about whether to keep moving toward the ladder or to stop. I kept moving. I want to be clear about that. I kept moving, and I got Ray out, and I sealed that hatch, and I did my job. But I also want to be clear about what it cost me to keep moving, because the cost was something I am still paying, and the currency it comes out of is the part of a person that believes the world is legible and safe and responds to professional competence. 3 years later, I still check the deadbolt on my front door twice before bed. Not because I think something is going to come through it, but because the checking is the only language I have left for a fear that does not have a cleaner form of expression. What I had not yet understood was that the night at the access shaft was not the end of anything. It was closer to a beginning, because whatever had used my name in the dark was still down there when the inquiry closed and the case was filed and everyone moved on. And the city, the ordinary surface city of traffic and weather reports and Tuesday afternoon maintenance calls, had no idea it was being listened to. The inquiry concluded in 6 weeks, and the official finding used the phrase structural failure and water ingress 11 times across 14 pages, and mentioned the words we were both thinking exactly 0 times. I sat in a conference room on the 4th floor of a municipal building, and I read the draft findings, and I signed my name to them. My hand was steady. I had practiced being steady for 6 weeks by that point, and I was very good at it. The investigator across the table had the tired, careful expression of a man who had decided what the report needed to say before he started writing it. Not out of dishonesty exactly, but out of the particular pragmatism of institutions that need to keep functioning after something goes wrong. You cannot keep a drainage department operational if the finding is that the lower eastern branch is home to something that used a weather forecast and prepared a barrier for weeks in advance. You cannot staff night shifts on that basis. So the finding was structural failure and water ingress, and a recommendation for improved radio protocols in confined spaces. I understood the logic. I even agreed with it on the level where you agree with things that are true enough to be useful, even if they are not true enough to be honest. What I could not agree with, in the part of myself I did not bring into that conference room, was the decision to leave the Eastern Branch on the active maintenance rotation. Same access schedule, same crew assignment process, same procedures that had sent Owen and Marcus in on a Tuesday afternoon during a peak rain event. I raised it once, not in the conference room, not on record, but to my supervisor in the corridor outside after the meeting, in the low voice you use when you are trying to say something important without it becoming official. I said the lower eastern branch should be taken off rotation pending a full structural review. He said the findings did not support a full structural review. I said I thought the findings were incomplete. He looked at me for a moment with the expression people use when they want you to understand that the conversation is over without having to say so. Then he thanked me for my cooperation during the inquiry and walked back toward his office, and that was the last time I raised it. I wrote a personal memo that same evening. Not an official document, just notes, dated, specific, everything I had observed and chosen not to include in the formal statement. The name in the tunnel, the smooth marks in the silt, the gap in the barrier, and the weeks of patient, incremental work it represented. I put it in an envelope and sealed it, and put it in a box in the back of my home office closet, behind a filing cabinet that nothing had any reason to move. I do not know entirely why I made it. Partly as a record, in case the decision to stay silent ever needed to be explained. Partly, I think, as a way of telling the truth to at least one witness, even if that witness was only a future version of myself. Pete's family held a memorial service 3 weeks after the inquiry closed. I attended. I stood at the back, and I looked at his mother and his younger brother at the front of the room, and I thought about the folded glove on the pipe bracket. Pete's glove. Pete's small hands. And I thought about all the things the official report had given them in place of an honest account. Structural failure. Water ingress. A tragedy of neglected infrastructure and inadequate safety protocols. I thought about whether that was better or worse than the truth. I still do not have a clean answer to that question. I think about it most often in October, when the rain starts coming in properly, and the days go gray, and the gutters fill fast. What I know is that I chose the report over the memo. I chose the institution over the record. And I have to live with that choice in the way you live with a decision that cannot be unmade, by carrying it at a weight your posture eventually starts to reflect. Ray came back to work 6 weeks after his shoulder surgery. He looked the same from a distance. Up close, if you knew him before, you could see the difference. A new economy of movement, a carefulness about where he stood in relation to open floor fixtures, a particular stillness that came over him sometimes in the middle of an ordinary conversation that had nothing to do with what he was saying and everything to do with whatever was running underneath it. We did not talk about that night for almost a month after he returned. When we did, it was not a conversation so much as a brief exchange in the vehicle bay at the end of a shift, standing next to his car in the dark, with the yard lights making everything look flat and overexposed. He said he had been having a recurring dream, not nightmares exactly, nothing dramatic, just the sound of water moving in a direction it should not be moving, and the feeling in the dream of being very still and very aware that stillness was the correct response, and that any other response would make things worse. He said he woke from it calm, which he found more unsettling than if he had woken frightened. Calm suggested the dream had reached some kind of understanding. He did not specify what understanding. He did not need to. I told him about the sound I had heard in the tunnel. Not everything, not the full account I have given you now, but the essential thing. The 2 syllables, the wrong register, the timing of it. I watched his face while I told him. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man hearing confirmed something he had already quietly decided was true and had been hoping someone would talk him out of. He said he thought he had heard something too in the seconds before the grate opened. Not his name, something else, lower, less formed, like a sound that was working toward language but had not arrived there yet. He said he had filed it under adrenaline distortion and left it there because the alternative was a category he did not have anywhere to put. Then he said something that I have thought about almost every day since. He said, "You know what bothers me most." And I said, "No, tell me." And he said, "It let us go." He said it slowly, like he was reading the words off something he had been carrying for weeks. It had me. It had enough of me to finish what it started. And it let us go. And I don't know if that means we weren't worth the effort, or if it means it wanted us to leave. And I don't know which one of those is worse. I did not have an answer for him then. I do not have one now. But I have spent 3 years turning that question over, and the longer I turn it, the more I think Ray was asking the wrong version of it. The question is not why it let us go. The question is what it expected us to do afterward. Whether leaving 2 witnesses was part of a calculation. Whether something that had learned to use weather patterns and structural weak points in the acoustic windows of rain events had also learned what witnesses do, what they say, and to whom, and how much of it gets believed. If it had, then letting us go was not mercy. It was maintenance. We were part of the system too, just the part that operated above ground. And the system, as I had spent 11 years learning, always finds a way to keep running. 2 years after the inquiry closed, a contractor named Hal quit a job in the Lower Eastern Branch mid-shift and walked off-site without filing a report. And nobody followed up on it, because the job got reassigned and completed, and the system kept running, which is exactly how these things disappear. I found out through a former colleague who mentioned it the way people mention things they think you already know, casually, as a reference point in a longer conversation about something else. He said Hal had been doing a routine valve check in the secondary corridor, the same corridor where Ray and I had found Owen and Marcus, and had come up the ladder at roughly the halfway point of his shift and told the crew chief he was done, and driven away, and not returned calls for 3 days. My colleague said the crew chief had written it up as a personal matter and left it there. No investigation, no follow-up inspection of the section, no note in the maintenance log, beyond a brief comment about an incomplete valve check. I called Hal. It took me 4 attempts over 2 weeks before he picked up. When he did, he was quiet for a long moment after I introduced myself and explained why I was calling. Then he said, "You were the inspector on the missing persons call." I said, "Yes." He said, "So you already know." I said I knew some of it. He said, "Then you know enough, and I would prefer not to talk about the rest." And then he said one thing before he ended the call, unprompted, in the same tone you use for something that has been sitting in your chest too long and finds its own way out, regardless of your intentions. He said, "The floor down there sounds different than it used to. Like something has been moving across it so many times in the same path that the concrete has started to give." I sat with that for a long time after he hung up. The floor sounding different. Concrete giving under repeated traffic. The kind of wear that accumulates over years of consistent use by something that knows its own roots. I thought about the smooth marks in the silt that Ray and I had both seen. I thought about the path along the left wall. I thought about years of movement through the same channel in the same direction, wearing the surface the way water wears stone, slowly, invisibly, until the evidence is structural rather than incidental. Then I thought about the maintenance rotation, the one my supervisor had refused to change after the inquiry, the one that still sent crews into that section on a regular schedule, rotating through different personnel so that no single person spent enough time there to accumulate the pattern of observations that Gloria had accumulated, that I had accumulated, that had made us each, in our own way, start to understand what we were sharing a sector with. That rotation was a feature, not a flaw, of the way the system had chosen to handle what it knew and could not say. I transferred to surface infrastructure work 8 months after the inquiry, and I told myself I was doing it for reasonable professional reasons, a change of focus, a better fit for my skills at that stage of my career, the kind of language you use when the honest language would cost too much. Carol did not ask questions about the transfer. She had stopped asking certain kinds of questions around the time I came home at 4 a.m. with Ray's blood on my jacket, and sat at the kitchen table and did not speak for a long time. She had recalibrated around the new version of me, the way people who love each other make room for things that cannot be fully explained, quietly, without drawing attention to the accommodation. Sophie noticed more directly. She was 14 by then, and sharp in the way teenagers are sharp, catching the things adults assume they are hiding. She asked me once, about a year after the transfer, why I never talked about the tunnels anymore, when I used to talk about work all the time. I said the new job was less interesting to describe. She looked at me with the unconvinced expression of someone who has already filed the real answer and is simply noting that I declined to provide it. She did not push, but she stopped asking me about infrastructure. And I think on some level she understood, without knowing any of the specifics, that the subject had a floor she was not meant to reach. I was 3 months into the surface role when the second piece of information reached me. A maintenance log entry, shared informally by a former colleague who thought I should know, flagged with a handwritten note that said, "Not sure what to do with this." The entry described a dog found dead near a storm grate in the industrial quarter, not far from the old access site. No vehicle strike, no signs of illness. The spine had been compressed, according to the worker who found it, in a way that suggested a single applied force from above, a deliberate downward pressure rather than impact. The worker who wrote the entry had noted it once, and then, according to my colleague, refused to work that section after dark, and had not been pushed on the refusal because the crew chief had read the entry and decided not to make it an issue. The entry had not been formalized. It existed only in the handwritten log that the crew kept for their own reference, the informal record that runs parallel to the official one in every maintenance operation I have ever worked with, the one where the real observations go, because the real observations do not always have a form to live in. I added it to the sealed envelope in my closet. The envelope was getting thick. What I could not add to any envelope was the change I had started to notice in myself during heavy rain events. Not panic, nothing that dramatic. Something quieter and more consistent. A heightened awareness that arrived with the sound of rain on the roof and did not fully leave until the gutter stopped running. A particular attention to the location of floor-level openings in whatever space I was in. A habit of sitting with my back to solid walls in rooms that had drain fixtures. Carol noticed the wall thing first. She mentioned it once, lightly, not as a complaint, more as an observation. The way you mentioned that someone has started holding their coffee cup differently. I said I was not aware I was doing it. She said she knew. And then she changed the subject in the gentle way she had learned to change certain subjects. And we moved on. And the rain kept coming down outside. And I kept my back to the wall. The thing about a habit formed by genuine threat is that it does not feel irrational. It feels like maintenance, like the thing a sensible person does to manage a known variable. I had a known variable. I was managing it as best I could with the tools available to me, which were mostly spatial and mostly invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. What I did not know yet was that the variable was not staying static, that the reports reaching me through former colleagues were not the scattered noise of an old incident refusing to fully close. They were data points in a pattern I had not yet seen the full shape of. And the shape, when I finally understood it, was not the shape of something that had settled back into its corner and resumed its ordinary behavior. It was the shape of something that had expanded its range, quietly, incrementally, the way it did everything else. The pattern I had been collecting in pieces for 2 years snapped into focus on a Tuesday evening when I spread every informal report, every second-hand account, every handwritten note from my sealed envelope across the kitchen table and looked at them as a single document for the first time. I had been reading them individually, each one a separate anomaly, each one deniable in isolation. The contractor who quit mid-shift, the dead dog near the grate, the night crew that refused a job in the old sector, a security guard from a warehouse on the Western Service Road who told a former colleague he had heard chain-dragging sounds under the floor during a blackout and had submitted his resignation the following morning without explanation. Each of these, alone, was nothing. A noise, a bad feeling, a personal decision that could be explained by a dozen ordinary causes. But laid out together on a kitchen table, in the order they had occurred, they described something that had no ordinary explanation at all. The incidents were not clustered around the original access point anymore. They had been in the first year after the inquiry, but the more recent ones were coming from further out, from sections of the network that connected to the lower eastern branch through the older, unmapped trunk lines, the ones that existed only on paper copies held by retired engineers. The range had expanded, gradually, incrementally, in the way that territory expands when something moves outward along existing routes rather than forcing new ones. It had been using the infrastructure the way water uses it, finding the path of least resistance, moving outward along connections that were already there. I measured the spread on a map that evening. I used the old paper copy I had kept from my inspection days, the one that showed the pre-expansion network in full, the one that included the sections taken off active rotation years ago. I marked each incident location with a pencil dot. Then I stepped back and looked at the pattern of dots across the map, and I felt something shift in my chest that was not quite fear, because I was past the kind of fear that arrives suddenly. It was something slower and colder. The recognition that the problem I had watched get filed and closed and designated as structural failure and water ingress was not a closed problem. It had never been a closed problem. It had been an expanding one, and the filing and the closing had given it 2 years of uninterrupted expansion, while everyone involved looked the other way, because looking the other way had been made into official policy. The dots covered roughly 3 times the area of the original incident site, and the most recent dot, the security guard with the chain dragging sounds, was on the Western Service Road, which was not in the industrial quarter anymore, which was in a mixed-use area. Businesses, residential buildings above them, ordinary street life, families, children walking to school over streets that sat on top of a network that something had been quietly colonizing for years, while the official record described it as resolved. I sat at that table for a long time. Carol was asleep. The house was quiet except for the rain that had started around 10, light and steady against the windows. I looked at the map and I thought about every decision point in the previous 2 years where a different choice might have changed the shape of those dots. My signature on the inquiry findings, my supervisor's closed expression in the corridor, the maintenance rotation that kept sending rotating crews into the sector in small enough numbers and short enough shifts that none of them ever accumulated enough to understand what they were working near. Every individual decision had its own reasonable logic. Assembled together, they had produced something that had no logic at all, except the logic of an outcome nobody had been willing to name. I took out a fresh sheet of paper and I started writing. Not a memo this time. Not a private record for a future version of myself. A full account. Everything. In the order it happened, with every detail I had withheld from every official statement. The name in the tunnel, the gap in the barrier, and what it meant about timeline and intent. The pattern on the map. Hal's observation about the floor. The dog. The security guard. All of it in plain language addressed to no one in particular, because I had stopped believing there was a particular someone who could receive it and know what to do with it. The institutions had already shown me their capacity, so I wrote it for anyone, for whoever came after me in whatever role I had occupied. The inspector standing at a boat that should not be seated, trying to fit the evidence into a sensible account, and finding that the account kept rejecting it. I wrote until the rain stopped. Then I sealed the new document in an envelope, added it to the box in the closet, and went to bed. I did not sleep well, but I had not slept well in 2 years, and I had learned to function inside that deficit the way you learn to function inside any condition that is not going to change, by building your life around it rather than waiting for it to resolve. That was the version of me that existed until a few months ago. The one who had made his accommodation with the knowledge and found a way to carry it without it showing too much. And then something happened that made the carrying feel insufficient and brought me to the point of telling you all of this now. A colleague I had not spoken to in over a year called me on a Wednesday morning and said she had something I needed to hear and asked if we could meet in person. We met at a coffee place near her office, outside, her choice, which I noticed. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph that a maintenance worker had taken 3 days earlier in the lower eastern branch during a routine check. The photo was taken looking down the secondary corridor, the one I had walked through with Ray, the one where we had found Owen and Marcus. The worker had taken it to document what he thought was unusual surface damage to the channel wall. What the photograph showed, at eye level on the right-hand wall, scratched into the old concrete in careful, deliberate lines were names. I could make out 6 of them clearly. I recognized 2 from incident reports that predated me in that sector by a decade. Owen was there. Marcus was there. Pete was not. There was a blank space at the end of the row, smooth and clean, the right width for one more entry, as if room had been kept. My name was not there. I want to be precise about that, because I think precision matters here. My name was not on that wall. But the blank space was. And whatever has been listening to the city from below long enough to learn names, long enough to collect them and record them in the dark in a passage that does not appear on any current map, had left exactly enough room at the end for one more. I do not know if that is a threat or a record or something that has no word in any language I speak. I know that when I looked at that photograph, my first instinct was to count the blank space, to measure it with my eyes, to assess it the way an engineer assesses a structural element. Old habits. 11 years of believing that measurement was the appropriate response to any problem the physical world produced. The measurement came back as this: whatever is in that system is not declining. It is not contained. It has been operating with patience and method for longer than anyone currently employed in that sector has been alive, and it has been doing so inside an infrastructure that was built to be maintained by people who rotate in and out on short cycles and never stay long enough to see the full picture. That is not an accident of design. That is, whether intentionally or not, the perfect arrangement for something that benefits from human attention arriving in fragments too small to assemble into understanding. Here is what I have concluded after 3 years of carrying this. The most dangerous thing in that tunnel is not what moves through it. The most dangerous thing is the assumption that a closed file means a closed problem. We built the system, and we named the channels, and we drew the maps, and then we trusted the maps more than we trusted what people actually saw and heard and smelled when they went below. We chose the paperwork over the witness every single time the two were in conflict. And the thing below us did not need to be clever or powerful or supernatural to survive that arrangement. It only needed to be patient. It only needed to wait for the next rotation, the next crew, the next inspector who would arrive with a list of sensible explanations and a very high threshold for the conclusion that none of them were going to hold. I am that inspector. I was that inspector. I sealed a bolt and signed a report and went home. And the problem kept expanding in the dark while I was managing my sleep deficit and keeping my back to the wall in rooms with drain fixtures. I do not tell you this as confession. I tell you this because I think most people in my position would have done exactly the same thing. And I think that is the point. The system does not fail because bad people make bad choices. It fails because reasonable people make reasonable choices inside a structure that was never designed to hold the truth about what lives at the bottom of it. Now, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. If you had been standing at that access shaft and seen that bolt, if you had smelled what I smelled, and read what the silence in that tunnel was telling you, would you have gone down? And if you had come back up, would you have written the true report? Or would you have found your own version of structural failure and water ingress, your own reasonable language for an unreasonable thing, and signed your name to it and gone home and told yourself it was the only realistic option? I have asked myself that question for 3 years. I still do not like my answer. Tell me yours in the comments below, because I think the answer says something important about all of us, not just about me. If this account reached you and you stayed with it to the end, leave a like and subscribe. There are other records like this one. Not all of them have been opened yet.